Welcome everyone to another episode of the Fire These Times. I'm your host ayoub, and I'll be joined today with first my co-host Leila Shami, as well as our guest from the collective Chkoun. They released a statement some time ago, which obviously we'll get into in this episode, and the title is "Solidarities are not a given; they need to be built," which I'll of course link in the show notes. Before we start, Leila, of course, you can introduce yourself briefly. I think most listeners know you by now. And then the folks over at Chkoun, you can do the same.
Hi, I'm Leila. I'm a writer and activist, mainly focusing on Syria, but also at the moment a lot on Palestine. And I'm a member of the Fire These Times team.
Well, we are two members of the collective Chkoun. We are now currently based in Berlin. We are a small collective of people of African descent, mainly from the region of the north of Africa. We try to always reflect on always saying North Africa as if it's like a separate entity or whatever. So we came together last year after the escalations that happened by the racist discourse of the president, Qais Said, and we came together to try to do something from where we are. I think we will get more into what's happening in Tunisia now, so we will get to that. Maybe.
And I think most of our work is focused on visibilizing and deconstructing discourse focused on anti-Black racism in the Northern African region. So this is at the heart of our topics, and we try to relate it to also internationalist solidarity in general by keeping the lens of anti-Blackness always in front of us.
Okay, so like the first question is a bit of a background question, as usually I do on this podcast, kind of ground the main article we're focusing on, or at least the general theme and so on. And so I'll just ask it as it is, and of course feel free to answer the way you feel most comfortable. So what prompted you to write this article at this specific time? Of course, mention also the context of when it was written and what you had kind of in mind. You already mentioned some of it now. Can you elaborate on what you called thunderous silence in the piece? And let's just start like this. It's already, I think, a big meta question, because of course then it's like I'm essentially asking you to talk to me about the entire thing in the first question, but we'll see what to take from that.
Okay. I think it started as, obviously we started working on this and trying to talk about this topic before October last year, and we were preparing events. We were also collaborating with some activists from Tunisia, Black activists in Tunisia, and also here in Berlin and in Europe. And we had an event planned also, and obviously the whole time this interconnects, and then what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine just made us really think about how everything is interconnected, and that was also an initial idea for us to write this. Concretely, it was definitely the enormous repression that we faced from the beginning on, especially in the first weeks, I think, of those, because I think we released this in November or December. I mean, we started working on it early November, and in those few weeks, there was a huge repression that Palestinian demos were banned. Wearing a kufiya was a crime in itself, the flag and so on. And we were really felt like this topic is being pronounced taboo, and we're not allowed to talk about it. And whoever is in solidarity is being criminalized. Whoever talks about it is being criminalized. The most affected people are just silenced completely. And concretely, it was an instant where, for example, there was this panel on the topic of migration and anti-Black racism in Tunisia by a famous foundation here. I don't know, we thought about a German foundation, and there were also people we know and work with that were invited to this panel, Black feminists from Tunisia. And so when basically this panel got cancelled because the panelists insisted on wearing kufiyas during the panel while talking about the topic that we wanted to, that basically talking about racism in our societies and how the majority in our society is also being maybe or not maybe definitely like complicit in this crime and this like really horrible stuff happening, and also given it excuses and so on. So we were very celebrated. We felt that we were talking about that, but at the same time, when we were linking it to racism that we experience here, or like how it all connects, or what it's like migration in its like broader sense and all of its aspects, we were being silenced and not allowed to talk. So for us, it was so much similarities and parallels between how that quickly comes, that the silencing and criminalization, and how majorities take over like the marginalized voices. And so it was important for us to, it wasn't an easy process also to write it. We were thinking a lot and discussing, and always keeping in mind our focus and how we want to center this also anti-Black racism in our societies, but still like in the in the interactions with all of the other aspects. So this was for us very clear, the parallels and the simultaneity of like these different kinds of repression, or
It was a great statement. I mean, it's so good to see people trying to build these connections between struggles and, you know, build more intersectional solidarity. I was very pleased to see that. I'm interested in what you're saying about the situation in Germany right now, because it's a very frightening times what's happening in Germany with the rise of the far right and the restrictions on activism.
We should say that we're recording this on June 11th. So the elections were like, you know, a couple of days ago. It wasn't actually in the initial questions, but then it felt like it's kind of the elephant in the room. So we'll just kind of mention it, and then we can also talk about everything else. Sorry, Leila.
No, it's fine. I'm just interested, like, what's the feeling there in Germany right now amongst the activist community, and how are people responding to this in terms of the way that they're organizing?
I think for us, this statement was a way to deal with how the communities are dealing with that since October, but also like a bit before. It has always been tense to address questions of colonization, questions of Palestine in Germany in general. And it has always affected racialized communities more, queer communities more, and so on. But since October, it's been, I think the way we're dealing with it is that a lot of communities are feeling detention. A lot of communities are struggling between each other, within each other. And I think this is why we wanted to focus on this statement, on keeping in front of us the bigger picture, that a lot of things are about colonial struggles and about racism and about a lot of stuff. Like, this is at the heart of the issue, and that a lot of us around the world are sharing this, and we need to keep this frame going so we can have solidarity between us. We don't need to understand the detail of each struggle. We don't need to know deeply about things to relate to them in that way, and to all be together from a decolonial perspective, like an active decolonial perspective. And I think we talk about it a lot, but we feel like each community is like pressured by the state and by the media and so on, and then it reverberates onto the communities themselves, and we don't feel like we're doing the work we would like to do, or like I think even grieving spaces are not that available because they get tense, because
it's not allowed at all. Yeah, it's really not allowed throughout. Like, it hasn't been at all possible to take a moment and also like grieve and like somehow give each like the humanity back to all of this. It's been really difficult.
And you talk about that in your article, because you talk about multidirectional grief. And this is something that I discuss a lot with Elia and others, in that we don't even have time to grieve at the moment because the violence is so systematic, it's so continuous. So how do you see multidirectional grief when you were writing the article?
And I would definitely like to add, because it's relevant. So I did an episode with Ayman Makarim, who's also one of the co-hosts and also does a separate podcast called Politically Depressed on this kind of network. We did an episode about, I don't know now, a couple of weeks ago on Gaza. And it wasn't by far the first episode on Gaza, but kind of the first episode where it was just me and him talking about it a bit kind of raw, let's say. And one of the things that Ayman pointed out is that there's been no time to grieve Gaza. He's in Vienna. He's talks about that as well on his podcast as well. And for pretty similar reasons, I would say historically, there's kind of been a similar crackdown in Austria on that, and also because like the violence itself is so systematic, so intense. Every day feels like worse than the day before. And whenever you feel like, oh, maybe enough is, as something's going to stop it or whatnot, then something else happens. And I've been very curious that term. I was mentioning this to Leila before we started recording because, in my own research, I work a lot on memory and hauntings and so on. And there is a term also called multi-directional memory and multi-directional, grief, you mentioned it obviously, but yeah, so multi-direction memory and rememberings and hauntings essentially says that we are affected by multiple forces of history at the same time, and they don't always affect us at the same time, right? Like sometimes one affects us more than the other. Sometimes maybe a certain component of our existence or our positionality is what defines us, or at least what impacts us most today compared to next week or whatnot. It might be that today being a male is good for me. Tomorrow being a male Arab is very bad for me, stuff like that. That's sort of how it, I connected a lot with that concept, but yeah, I wanted to add what Leila was asking.
Yeah, I think for us, it was also this like feeling like, one puts different hats depending on what's happening. Like, we were like here grieving also, I don't know, like everything that's been going on, in Palestine, but then also back home, this like really big threat to like, the little democracy that was there, for example, and then at the same time, many people also for dying through these deportations that are happening, and actually also excused through the society and the state. So it's exactly what you put it. It's in different times, just feeling different things, and then this continuous aspect of it is really what I think when we wrote multidirectional grief, it was kind of to express something we felt, and we didn't think about it in any theoretical way or something, but it was really what we felt is that all of these places in the world are like burning, and like we hear this news, we don't know what to do with it, and then comes the next horrible news, and we didn't know what to do with all of that. And at the same time, if we wanted to do something about it, if it was Palestine, we would face this huge repression here in Germany. If it was about our topic, which like relating to Tunisia, for example, we would be also facing criminalization. So it's really all these different aspects. So I think it was for us, we needed to find the word for it, and that's what came out of what we were experiencing. And it was also different phases, I think. In the beginning, it was this shock about how everything is banned or criminalized all of a sudden, and then it's the feeling the power of we're defying this, we're doing something, and then on the long term that doesn't work. Like someone at some point, you feel the grief is taking over so much, but we are still, I think,
And I think it also came from a thought of, I don't know if it's our generation, millennials and the surroundings, or maybe it's just millennial centrism that says that. But anyway, since the 21st century, there is like this research that talks about how armed conflicts and wars changed. And the big difference is not about the numbers, it's about that wars do not end anymore. So every armed conflict, every catastrophe that we grew up with, that we somehow related to as Northern Africans or whatever, it almost none of them did really stop, or like if foreign invaders are not there anymore for a reason or another, the destruction is still there. Mm-hmm. And I feel like at that point it just became too much, because when we came together about Tunisia, we were already feeling it too much mm-hmm. at that point. And then it just kept piling up, and also with like how we felt from the times of what happened in Ukraine and how it touched different people differently. Here in Germany, it was very visible how every refugee crisis, quote unquote, is treated. And it was very distressing to see also the brown people that were in Ukraine, how they were treated. Mm-hmm. So it was just like a very long accumulation of upset and powerlessness and not knowing what to do and all of this. And I think what I wanted to add to that is, what you said about like this cognitive dissonance of like what you can say where, and it's getting really confusing, and where you can be upset about what. And it just felt a bit inauthentic to talk about anti-Black racism in Germany or talk about Palestine in Northern Africa. And you're like, what are we doing if we separate these things? Like, it needs to be all together at once everywhere. And that was the point of what we were trying to say. Mm-hmm. And I think about the grief, and like it was a whole reflection about how we think about death as a society or as societies. And there is a part that is the whole conversations about necropolitics and which bodies' deaths matter more. And it's very visible today with Gaza, but it's also visible, has been there. I think in our collective, the whole point is talk about the politics of erasure, like visibilizing what's happening and keep it connected with the current talks of everything. And there's, for example, the genocide in Sudan is not talked about enough, and there's quite connections there. But also for a long time, I think that one did not stop. Like the number of Black bodies in the Mediterranean is incredible and incredibly overlooked from both sides of the Mediterranean. It just became so normalized to see bodies dying in the Sahara and in the Mediterranean, and it's overlooked by everybody.
You have the very, very powerful statement in your statement, which says, you know, some lives are more grievable than others, and we certainly see that big hierarchy in which causes or issues get given attention, both by politicians and by states, but also within the activist community in terms of solidarity.
Yeah, just to add that what we are seeing, for example, now is that nothing puts something as much on the global agenda as when, for example, white lives are targeted. And this is what brings it always back to the agenda. And this is what also adds, of course, to this, like really seeing it very clearly how some lives are more grievable than others. Some other lives are not really stripped of humanity. You don't see them human until you prove it somehow. It has to be proven, but then also that's too late. So,
yeah. First, thanks a lot for what you said and like that intervention. And I'm from Lebanon, mostly work on Lebanon, and there's a number of parallels, not on a lot of things, obviously, but Lebanon has a large refugee population, of course, overwhelmingly or mostly Syrians. And the way Syrians have been racialized is the way, that's the process that's been happening in the past decade or so, has echoes in Lebanon on the way Palestinians were racialized before. So when I say racialized, most people would identify as like roughly the same ethnicity or whatever, but then there's a process of separating one group from the other, and of course putting one group over the other. And in the case of Lebanon, of course, putting the Lebanese and especially Lebanese middle class and upper classes above the rest. But then Lebanon also has something called the kafala system. And here I'm mentioning it for those listeners who don't know. We've done a number of episodes on this in the past. Kafala means sponsorship in Arabic, and effectively, I won't go into it too much, but it's part of the approach in which racialization in Lebanon, specifically targeting migrant domestic workers who are overwhelmingly also gendered, so overwhelmingly women, from mostly Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, and the Philippines, but also other parts of Africa and Asia, especially Southeast Asia. It's almost like there's been kind of a racial hierarchy, if you see what I mean, with them especially and migrants, the refugees and migrants at the bottom. And the way this is now being kind of systematized, I just finished writing an article. It might be out by the time this is out, I don't know, for Al Jazeera, on the way that, because the EU recently sent €1 billion to the Lebanese state to quite literally join. I mean, they were already doing it, but now it's almost like more official. Join the EU's border regime, essentially. What the EU has been doing with Tunisia, with Libya, with Egypt, they want to now do with Lebanon. And it's very interesting, like someone who has patience, and I don't, but someone's patience will go through the discourse and how it has shifted in the past decade or so, even within the EU, in which I'm sure if someone's done kind of like a quantitative analysis even of the words used, you will see words like democracy and human rights and whatnot being used less and less and less. And then we have words like security and borders and whatever used more and more. And of course, this entire securitization of migration itself. I'm a migrant in Europe as well. I'm not European. The securitization of migration itself is kind of in many circumstances kind of the elephant in the room in a lot of discussions within Europe, political discussions specifically within Europe, when not made explicit, as the far right obviously does. The centrists, quote unquote, usually try to appeal to that or to dog whistle, either by mentioning it directly, which I've noticed they've been doing more and more, including Labour in the UK and centrist, center-leftists also in the EU, are appealing to that rhetoric more and more, and essentially ceding ground to effectively the far right, only strengthening it when they probably think that by doing so they are weakening the far right, and we're seeing the exact opposite happening. As I said, the elections were a couple of days ago, and especially in Germany and France, the results have been pretty terrible. If you have reflections on that, please feel free, Leila, as well, because of course we have another question, but I said a lot now.
Well, I'm interested linking into what Elia's just been talking about, because the EU has given massive amounts of funding to Tunisia, to Lebanon, to Turkey, to curb migration and to stop migrants reaching Fortress Europe. And I think there's very little discussion here in the West about how that's fueling mass human rights violations abroad. So I'm interested to hear a little bit about Tunisia and how people in Tunisia are organizing against that, and whether they're taking actions directly on this issue around the EU. Also Sudan. I mean, the EU's giving money to the Rapid Support Forces, which have been carrying out mass human rights violations in Sudan. So it's a very sensitive issue. Europe doesn't want the human rights abuses on its soil, but it's just externalizing them and pushing the problem elsewhere.
I think Europe is increasingly okay with human rights abuses on its soil.
Of course.
But yeah, point made regardless, yeah.
Yeah, I think the narrative is that always we didn't know about these abuses that were taking place. But then I think very quickly, quick investigative research, not to undermine how thorough they are, but just show how much in the know Europe is about what's happening, really, like this report that just went out, especially on
the Lighthouse report.
Yeah, the Lighthouse report on, I think, Morocco, Mauritania, and Tunisia. So, I think also like relating to this, I relate a lot when you say this, that security has become the word here in Europe, but that's also what, for example, the Tunisian president always says, like whoever is helping migrants, whoever is just, sometimes even criticizing, it's against state security. This is against state security. And that's like really the dangerous that is related to very, very high charges of treason and whatnot. Mm-hmm. So I think this whole, and also like framing it as a conspiracy and as something like, I feel like whenever that argument comes up, you can't like discuss any further, like facts and reason and logic doesn't help so much when that's the...
He's really refashioned, hasn't he, the kind of white, far right, great replacement theory to suit Tunisia, basically saying that black migrants are creating a demographic threat and changing the cultural makeup of Tunisia.
Yeah, and that they want to invade the country. And so this is really something that's for sure, it's... I mean, we always think of but this is like clearly fascist ideology. I think some people don't immediately want to call it fascism. That's like specific maybe to Europe, but it has a lot of that. But what did I want to say? Yeah, obviously this affects a lot the solidarity on the ground. I think a lot of people last year there were lots of mobilizations against this, also explicitly naming that this is against racism, this is against this whole conspiratorial discourse for freedom of movement. This was like last year, lots like many movements and many protests. I think at the same time that this started happening and like the discourse changed, the state discourse changed, there was also an immediate criminalization of, for example, offering migrants that don't yet have a legal status, whatever that means, because there are many, almost no migrant has a legal status in Tunisia. Also, European expats, quote unquote, but they're never bothered, for example, about that. And it's like, obviously, like you said, the hierarchy of migrants that is established. But so what we were witnessing last year is that the frame of where we could take action was narrowed down so much. It had to be like through other ways of trying to help, even with basic necessities like water and food and shelter and so on. And then I think, for example, most recently, like that, the criminalization also escalated in that people were arrested that work on racial justice and on migration issues. They are actually arrested for doing this work also. So those most vocal are actually now sitting in jail as per beginning of May. For example, Saadia Musbah, who is like the very outspoken Black feminist, Tunisian Black feminist who is the head of an association called Minamti, who works on racial justice since years, decades, I would say. And she's been in jail. I think the how do you say, the pattern is to arrest without charges first, jail someone, and then somehow find the charges. So it's kind of really, and also other people working in NGOs are still arrested. Also Sharifa Riahi, who has been also in jail while having a 2-month-old baby, for example. It's like really, really, and also many others. I think we only hear about maybe the people that are a bit more famous, but many other people are being investigated right now and so on. And us being also not in the country, I think maybe we don't get so much how bad it is, because here we still kind of can talk and like mobilize some stuff. But yeah, I think it's affecting also the protest against this a lot. But I personally still see a lot of hope. I hope, like, for example, this past 2 weeks, there was also a massive demonstration that for the first time for me, I noticed was linking this a lot to the EU deals and like talking, like more and more people are talking about the role or like these deals that are being made with the EU, especially Meloni, the Italian prime minister. So it's more and more in the consciousness, I think, of the society. And I think that's also a good development. And there was a big demo in light of all this repression to see that many people and young people went out and protested and like directly criticized the government and so on. So that was something that at least recharged a little bit our efforts. Yeah.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks for that. I mean, since this podcast is it's in English, and so all listeners would have heard of called Black Lives Matter in 2020. One thing that's less known is that for example, in Lebanon, as far as I know, this happened in other parts of the Arab world, but I just know Lebanon on this specific example. I mean, there were people, for example, protesting on the streets, people who were not black, I should say, because this is relevant to the story, saying basically, Lebanese lives matter. And what was kind of ironic, and many immediately pointed that out, of course, is that there is an argument to be made that in Lebanon, anyone who's not rich or, connected to the government or whatnot, their lives don't matter. But as I, mentioned earlier, there is a hierarchy there, and none of the folks who were, holding that banner and whatnot were part of the, for example, the migrant domestic workers or Syrian refugees or whatnot. There are actual black people in Lebanon whose lives do not matter to the Lebanese state, and to a significant extent to the rest of the population as well. This is part of the way racialization then becomes internalized, for lack of a better term. It becomes part of the culture in many ways, and untangling that is, of course, difficult, but it must be done. Otherwise, there's a bit of in my view, kind of a hypocritical air to talking about justice and whatnot against oppressive structures. And in Lebanon, just a quick addition to that, in October 2019, we had a big uprising. And I was there, and I know from friends of mine who were Syrians that they were also there with us, but they couldn't say so. They couldn't say that they are Syrians among us. They could just, chant and whatnot, but just don't be visibly Syrian, obviously. And this has a layer of quote unquote privilege as well, because most of the Syrians would not be perceived as black in Lebanon. So if you were, like, for example, Sudanese, it would be even more difficult for you to take part in those protests because you would immediately stand out. And then you would be a target, essentially, if not by the protesters themselves, at the very least by the security forces. So all of those layers are, of course, not easy to. Okay, I honestly think they are easy to comprehend, because it is power and it is oppression and it is all of that. But they're not easy in the sense that many people don't want to talk about it. That's what I meant. Your specific positionality is worth. We of course have been talking about it now, but worth, if you want, digging kind of in a way of slowly wrapping up our conversation. Digging through a bit, because you come from a very specific specific community in Tunisia, and now, of course, also in the diaspora. Do you think this gives you a sense of a perspective, for better or worse, at the very least, to understand the suffering or the experiences that, for example, Palestinians in Gaza are going through, even if it's not the same, quote unquote, but it doesn't have to be the same for us to have kind of this expanded compassion, in my opinion. How have you been reflecting on this? Because, of course, you released this with at least Gaza partly in mind, of course, in the statement.
I think there's a bottom line that also we wanted to convey in this conversation, and that should not be lost, is, first of all, it's very important for us to, as of our positionality, it's important for us to not be in support out of identity affinity or something like that. It is about an anti-colonial struggle, may it be in Palestine, may it be in Sudan. It's not only Black people killing each other, it is a colonial struggle. Everything that's happening everywhere, it's about an anti-colonial framework that we are in solidarity because of that. And that's a really important point that we want to emphasize, because there is a danger to be in support just because Palestinians are Arab or Muslims or something like that, which is the rhetoric that we grew up with in our countries. And it's dangerous not only for the Palestinian cause, but also for the support of Africans that are our neighbors, our ancestors, there's a lot of connection there. So we should not stop at that. We need to be in support to be in resistance to coloniality. And for example, we were talking about that when we were preparing this, is that there's a big element of performativity in our countries when it comes to supporting Palestine, for example. It's not just because we share, or like a majority of us share heritage or a religion, that it makes us feel it more. And that we also have like a different responsibility and allyship to show in this respect, without forgetting what we're doing to our neighbors and to Black people in our countries and so on. And I think, I don't know if it was in this statement or another statement, is that, or in connection to what you also was saying, is that we forget that, let's say, it's not because you're oppressed that you would have the same oppression as a Black person, for example. There are Black Jewish populations that are being treated horribly at the moment and historically in the creation of the state of Israel, and even before that. There is always layers to keep into consideration, and they are racist and colonial. So it's by keeping this idea in mind, and that we need to be in solidarity, not because we identify with somebody or a community, it's because human rights are important, and the human dignity of people that have been stripped of that historically does matter. So we start with, we also relate to Africa a lot and to Black identities a lot, but it's also important for us that the Palestinian support rhetoric enters into that. It's about community. I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, I think we were discussing this also, that we really think that if it's not framed, like if it's outside of this anti-colonial frame, which is what brings what we think is the true solidarity, then it's long-term depoliticizing to make it about this affinity or like this identity that just resonates with us. For example, when we were talking also about this statement and preparing for it, I think it came to us a lot, this concept of like, what contexts are we in? Because it really shifts. Like back home, we have citizen privileges compared to the migrants or the people that are and Black people passing through the country. Here we don't. So it's really about also positionality in terms of context of where and when is this happening. Like, and I think that's what we came like to realize about how we want this to be perceived, to always keep ourselves in check also. Where are we and when is all of this happening, and what is the history of all of this? So, yeah.
Thanks for that. Leila, did you want to say something? Because I could definitely go on forever.
Well, it was a little bit linked to what you've just been talking about, because in the statement you talk about how also the state instrumentalizes the Palestinian cause and uses the Palestinian cause for its own political agenda, whilst Palestinian migrants in Tunisia are facing a lot of problems. That's very interesting for me because, of course, we see that very much in Syria, where my family's from, where the Syrian state likes to present itself as the protector of Palestinian rights, part of the axis of resistance. But then, of course, many Palestinians are rotting in the regime's prisons. Many Palestinians have been killed. Also in Lebanon, Palestine is very much part of the political discourse, but Palestinian refugees live in really horrific conditions inside the camps in Lebanon.
Yeah, it's an easy way to frame it in Lebanon is like Palestine is easy to talk about just as long as you don't have any Palestinians in the room. That's basically how politicians do it in Lebanon.
Yeah. This was very clear to us also. Since always, I think also the solidarities that we're building between Palestinian migrants and other Black and African migrants in Tunisia is something that I think there was an article about this in Intifada, how also facing the same conditions of not getting legal status, basically. And the Palestinian migrants were also in their testimony saying how really like this is nothing compared, for example, to someone who is from Gambia or Guinea or something. But that's I think because it's really affecting everyone, including Palestinians, who the state really likes to vent about how great this has been forever, that visas are denied, procedures are really delayed, and everything that brings along with it, right? To not have like this regular status, if we say it like that, and then especially after October, that we've seen these images of really instrumentalizing this image of bringing in some injured people from Gaza, and that's really few people that were brought in. First of all, that's nothing that someone should tap on the shoulder for, because that. And then after that, just for the PR image, and just now also some new reports and people who followed up were saying that those that were brought in for treatment are now not getting the treatment, or the treatment's being delayed, or this promised financial help is not delivered, for example. So then we see again that it's actually, okay, like the picture is, I don't know, taken. So the true solidarity with migrants is then not there. So it's really pure instrumentalization, and it's really performative. Yeah,
it's the same in Morocco just to make a point about, as long as it's not political, we're all supporting Palestine and the demos are okay to a certain extent. But at the moment, there's university students are organizing to ask for an enforcement of or like cutting ties with the academic and knowledge influence of Israel, and cutting ties with university partnerships there. And that gets complicated. That gets a lot of pushback, especially in private universities, surprisingly.
What you said also, I think yesterday, that you said it's okay unless it's asking the state something, or like it's demanding something from the state, like, I don't know. Yeah,
in Syria, there was this term called tanfis, and we've mentioned this on this podcast a few times, and it's a tactic that the regime, Hafez and then Bashar, would use. It. Tanfis, for those listeners, it just means like letting out steam kind of thing in English, I guess. And the idea is that they would just allow things from time to time. They will allow one protest, it's more maybe something from time to time, as long as it doesn't do anything or doesn't go anywhere. Now, the crucial thing about Tanfis that's interesting is that sometimes the protest gets out of hand from the perspective of the regime, and then they regret allowing it in the first place. But we see like regimes learning from this in many ways. Like you have the Sisi regime that allowed a tiny bit of this during the COP, and I really mean a tiny bit. And now with Gaza, like cracking down immediately. And for me, when we speak a lot of performativity, the Qatar World Cup always comes to mind a lot. There was a lot of performative pan-Arabism, whatever. And so there you could have Palestine flags, for example, no problem. And you would have a lot of people online also being very happy about like some Israeli journalists being yelled at or whatever. And I don't care if that happens. But like that would be in contrast with no one really wanting to talk about the migrant workers who built the Qatar World Cup in the first place, who overwhelmingly come from countries like India and Bangladesh and so on.
Or the states pursuing their policies of normalization with Israel at the time either.
Exactly. And so this is where it gets like, I think you put it perfectly. Like, it's kind of depending on where there are levels to this, but overall it's fine if you can talk about it. It's fine if you say this is not nice, but as long as you don't like ask us to do anything specifically, and more importantly, don't disagree with us publicly, of course. And don't accuse us of anything. Like in Egypt, don't accuse us of, being complicit in the genocide, which they are, and so on. This is where it can, of course, get tricky. In Lebanon, you have the same actors, the same state, the same sectarian politicians in the same sentence, almost saying that like we are with our Palestinian brothers and sisters against the Zionists or whatever, but also they cannot stay in Lebanon. And at the same time. And they don't see a contradiction to that because they frame it within a nationalist discourse. And that's, for me, this is what the trap comes in, right? Whether it's nationalism, whether it's pan-nationalism, whatever. There are caveats sort of this. We won't get into them too much. But as a general rule, I'm kind of skeptical of where they usually lead because they're easily captured by state forces. I kind of just want to leave the floor to you in many ways to just kind of reflect if you want. If there's anything, of course, if there's anything we didn't have time to get into, because of course we can't do everything, please feel free to bring it up now. And tell folks where they can find your work. I'll put everything in the show notes anyway, but you can tell them anyway.
I think maybe as one of the last words, maybe I want some others. It's really important to keep in mind, I'm coming back to this colonization situation. It's important to, I think, in connection with Europe and keeping Europe's responsibility in all of this, is that sometimes it's funny to hear Europeans or saying or like being outraged about some stuff that we grew to find not normal, but it's part of the narratives we grew up with, and we're not surprised that things are happening. And the situation with Palestine, for example, in Germany, a lot of people are scared about what's going to happen to freedom of speech, for example, and like basic human rights. And now it's racialized Europeans, for example, that are starting to really get scared because they know they're going to be next in line to be affected in these things. But it's important to keep in mind the reminder that this is history repeating itself. And in the same ways that colonization started by trying techniques on African populations, on learning how to operationalize genocide in Namibia, for example, or how Le Pen started his career in torturing people in Algeria. This is the sources of how or what led to the World War, to World War II. Like all of this was learned on the backs of Black bodies and racialized bodies and so on. So it's really important not to detach from each issue or like keep it separated or like even calling it the Palestine-Israel issue or the Near East issue or the migrant issue. And what we mean by migrant is like Black people dying in the Mediterranean. It's all coming from the same history, and it's all gonna affect all of us at some point. And in the same way that what happened throughout colonization and decolonization, it did affect people in Europe too. Like if people are feeling safe right now, may they be racialized or white, they will be affected eventually. And this is really important to remind people about that all these issues are not happening in a vacuum. And the horrors that happened to our ancestors 100, 200 years ago have taught regimes to do what's happening today. And and the externalization of borders in Africa, for example, is a clear example of this coloniality that is still happening, that they just don't want things to be happening in their backyard in Europe, in the West. If it's not seen, if it doesn't mean it's not happening. The same way that the left could not stop colonization, even though they thought it was not moral or whatever, but they did not fight strong enough to stop that. It's the same that's happening now. It's not because it's going to happen in Africa that there will be detention centers in Northern Africa, in Uganda, in Senegal, and so on. There's a lot of countries being involved in this process. And you said also like Lebanon now. I actually did not know that Lebanon is getting also money for that now. So the whole majority world is going to start holding these horrors so that people in the West do not see them. It does not mean that it's not going to come to them at some point.
Yeah, I completely agree. I will have so much to add, but I think the way you ended it is perfect. So on that note, thank you a lot, you two, for doing this. This was really an amazing conversation. And of course, I will add all of the relevant links and sources and whatnot in the show notes, as I usually do when I don't forget, and I will not forget this time around. Thanks a lot for doing this, honestly.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like it could go on really forever. And thank you so much for inviting us.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us. Yeah, it was a great conversation. A lot to think about.
This has been another episode of the Far East Times. If you like this podcast, please consider leaving a 5-star rating or review on whatever podcast app you're listening to this on. And if you really like this podcast, head on to patreon.com/firethesetimes. That's patreon.com/firethesetimes. The Fire These Times is a media ecosystem based in the Periphery that supports a bunch of media projects including this one. For $5 a month, and even less if you opt for the yearly subscription, you can help this ecosystem grow and get early access to all episodes of The Fire These Times, Politically Depressed, Obscuristan, and Khida, as well as an invitation to join our monthly hangout, watch parties, upcoming book club, as well as exclusive episodes. Thank you for listening, and take care everyone.